Hello, American history students. Welcome to the study guide. So basically what we're going to do is I'm going to go over the printed study guide, or I guess the electronic study guide that I gave you the other day, and basically just go through the answers one by one. So what you should do while I'm going over this is follow along on your study guide, pay attention to the questions, and listen to my answers and see if the answers that you have on your study guide match the things that I'm saying. So listen for any differences between what you wrote down and what I say. Basically, if you can get all the answers to the study guide right, you should be able to get all the answers on the test right. So this is your opportunity to learn all the stuff you need to know for the test. Hopefully this will be a review for most of you guys, but some of this stuff was a long time ago, so I bet that this refresher will be helpful. So let's get started. We're going to go all the way back to Jackson and mass democracy. So question number one, what was the American system and what was the purpose of the American system? Okay, so the American system is basically an economic system with three different parts. It calls for internal improvements, that is government spending money on stuff like canals and railroads. It calls for a protective tariff, which is basically something that blocks trade with England and other countries and helps American factories to grow. And third, it calls for a Bank of the United States. So tariffs, Bank of the United States, and internal improvements. And so the purpose of these three different reforms is to help American industry develop. That is, it wants to help America go from a country of mostly farms to a country with lots and lots of factories, because factories make a country strong. All right, question number two. What big change in American politics helped Andrew Jackson to win the election of 1828? The big change that happened around this time period was that poor white men were allowed to vote. This was a big change because before 1828, only rich white men were allowed to vote. So this greatly expanded the size of the electorate, and it helped a kind of rough southern guy like Andrew Jackson to beat the kind of fancier northern guy, John Quincy Adams. And so this paves the way for mass democracy. Number three, what political party did Jackson found and what did it stand for? Answer. Jackson founded the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party represented poorer Americans, especially from the South and West. It, what else did it do? It advocated for westward expansion. It wanted the United States to grow and to take land, especially from Mexico, and also from Native Americans. And third, it wanted to fight against the American system. It did not like the American system, and it did not want America to become a nation of factories. All right, what was the Tariff of Abominations? This is question number 4, and how did South Carolina respond to it? The Tariff of Abominations abominations means basically like monstrous or terrible. So the monstrous tariff. This was a name given to the tariff by South Carolina. And now South Carolina hated tariffs. And the reason that South Carolina hated tariffs was that it got most of its money by trading cotton that it grew to Great Britain in exchange for other stuff. So if South Carolina couldn't trade with Britain, then South Carolina's economy was totally messed up. So South Carolina really hated the Tariff of Abominations because it was a new tariff introduced around 1829, 1830, that basically raised the tariff so that it was so high that nobody would ever trade with England. So this was going to kill South Carolina's economy. In response to the Tariff of Abominations, South Carolina says that it's going to nullify the law. Now, to nullify a law means to basically say that they're going to ignore the law. And so South Carolina says we're going to just ignore the government on this one and we're not going to enforce the tariff. This leads to something called the Nullification Crisis. So let's go on to question 5. How does Clay's compromise resolve the Nullification Crisis? So Henry Clay, as you might remember, was a statesman from Kentucky And he wants to avoid a civil war, and he's worried that South Carolina is going to go to war with the government over this tariff. And so he comes up with a compromise. He says, all right, well, we both have to give a little ground, otherwise South Carolina is going to fight us. So how about this? We'll lower the tariff, and we'll have a smaller tariff that'll make it possible to trade with Great Britain. And if South Carolina is still not happy with that smaller tariff, then we're going to allow President Andrew Jackson to get an army and to go down to South Carolina and kill them. So they have an option. They can either accept this lower tariff or they can face Andrew Jackson. South Carolina, probably wisely, chooses to accept Clay's lower tariff, and peace is restored. Question number 6. What were the assimilated tribes of the eastern United States like before the Indian Removal Act? So the assimilated Native American tribes were a couple of tribes, 3 or 4 tribes, who had basically accepted white culture. They had gone from being traditional hunter-gatherers and traditional farmers in the Native American style to basically living the way white Europeans lived, with a couple differences. But so they had accepted life in towns and villages, they had accepted farming, they had accepted constitutional government, and they had also accepted slavery. So they basically lived the same way that white settlers in their area lived. And they lived mostly in the South. But so the Indian Removal Act kind of doesn't recognize any of this. And so we're going to talk about the Indian Removal Act in these next few questions. So number 7 is, why did many white Americans support the Indian Removal Act? Basically, the Indian Removal Act was going to kick all of the Indians off of their land. For example, the Cherokee Indians owned a significant portion of the state of Georgia. So the reason white Americans wanted the Indians removed from their land was, one, they wanted that land so they could farm it instead of the Indians, but also gold had been discovered on Cherokee lands in Georgia. And so basically, as soon as they found out that this was good land that the Native Americans had, the white people went back on their word and kicked the Native Americans off of the land. Question 8. What did the Indian Removal Act do, and what was its impact on Eastern Native Americans? So the Indian Removal Act basically said that they were going to take all of the Native Americans who lived in the Southeast, in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi, and basically force them all to move out west. They had to move to special reservations to the west of the Mississippi. And this was really a humanitarian catastrophe. It was terrible for Native Americans. Many of them, some of them were compensated. They were given some money for leaving, but the money wasn't sufficient, and a lot of Native Americans died during the travel from the eastern United States to the western United States. Some of this traveling along a particular route was called the Trail of Tears because so many Native Americans died trying to make the trip. So it was really terrible. It killed many Native Americans and also destroyed a lot of the unique cultural traditions that had developed in these Native American communities. All right, number 9. Okay, moving back to, we're going to talk now about the Bank of the United States and how Andrew Jackson tries to get rid of the bank. So what was the purpose of the Bank of the United States? Well, basically, the purpose of the Bank of the United States was twofold. One was to give the United States a stable currency. Basically, the bank was in charge of printing money. And if you let too many people be in charge of printing money, you'll end up with way too much printed money, which will mess up the economy because money will lose value. So the only people that were allowed to print money at first was the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States printed money and kept the value of money stable. The second purpose was to loan money out to people so they could use this borrowed money to invest in stuff. They could use it to start up a factory or buy land, stuff like that. So, in short, the Bank of the United States was a good thing and an important part of the United States economy. So, Jackson hates the bank, and this leads to question number 10. How did Jackson's destruction of the Bank of the United States affect the American economy? Well, basically, it leads it leads to the destruction of the bank and the creation of lots of small banks. And these banks print way too much money, and they give out loans irresponsibly. So they start lending out money to people who don't deserve these loans. And this wrecks the American economy because money loses its value, and the banks lose a lot of their money because they give out bad loans. And this leads directly to the panic of, I don't remember the year exactly, 1829, 1830, I don't know. You can Google it. But there's a panic after Jackson destroys the bank, and it's because he destroys the bank that, I think it's 1838. But it happens because of Jackson's destruction of the bank. Okay, so number 11 says, why was Jackson's veto of the bank bill important? Basically, Andrew Jackson vetoes the bank bill and thereby kills the bank. But why does this matter so much? It's important because before Andrew Jackson vetoed the bank bill, presidents only vetoed when they thought something was unconstitutional. If they didn't like something but they thought that it was allowed by the Constitution, then they accepted it. Jackson knew that the bank bill was constitutional. He knew it was allowed. The United States had been doing this for a long time. He vetoed the bank bill and killed the bank because he didn't like it. And so he changes the way presidents use the veto. Instead of using it to ensure constitutionality of laws, he uses it to just get rid of laws he doesn't like. And so this greatly expands the power of the president and sets an important precedent for later presidents. Number 12, how did politics change after poor white men were allowed to vote? Basically, it changed politics from kind of a private affair of a few influential people to a big public spectacle. And it changed the way people talked about politics. It went from talking about the issues, like whether a tariff is good or bad for the United States, to talking about the president's background or the candidate's background. And you'll remember maybe the election of William Henry Harrison, in which they totally ignore the issues and instead just argue that William Henry Harrison would make a good president because he was born in a log cabin and he liked to drink hard cider. They're very clearly here just trying to appeal to poor Americans, and the strategy works. William Henry Harrison is elected without ever actually talking about political issues. Number 13, what did the Whig Party and the Democratic Party stand for? Okay, so the Whig Party was kind of a representative of the wealthier Americans, and it also stood for the American system. It really wanted America to become a strong nation of factories, an industrial nation. Opposed to this, the Democratic Party, which we already talked about, opposed the American system. They wanted America to remain a nation of farms, and it supported westward expansion. Poorer people tended to support the Democratic Party, and richer people tended to support the Whig Party. All right, we're moving on now to the section on Northern society. So, why did more cities form in the North than in the South? The main reason for this is that there was no slavery in the North and there was slavery in the South. And so when there's slavery in the South, the rich people in the South, instead of investing their money in cities and factories, invest their money in land and plantations and slaves. And so you don't really see any cities develop in the South, and that's because of their old-fashioned system based on slave labor. Number 2, how did the massive waves of immigration affect the United States? Okay, so in the 1840s and 1850s and going on until the early 1900s, millions and millions of immigrants come into the United States. The first 2 big waves of immigration were Germans and Irish people. And the massive waves of immigration led to a lot of nativism among Americans who already lived here. They thought that it was bad that these new groups of people were coming in, but immigration actually gave a lot of good stuff to the United States. It contributed to cultural diversity, new ideas, new foods, new traditions. It also helped the U.S. economy because all of these people coming over were willing to work really hard. And so the immigration meant that there was a fresh supply of labor in the United States, both to go out into the country and farm, and also to work in the newly built and newly developing cities in all of these factories that were popping up. 3. Okay, so why, if immigration was good, did lots of native-born Americans dislike German and Irish immigrants? The main reason was that, well, there were probably 2 reasons. One is that native-born Americans were xenophobic. That meant that they didn't respect other people's traditions, and they didn't really respect people from places that they didn't know. They were kind of closed-minded. But the second is that German and Irish immigrants competed with native-born Americans for jobs. And so a lot of people thought that Irish immigrants especially were stealing jobs that rightly belonged to Americans. And a lot of people didn't like this. Number 4, how did advances in transportation help to cause the market revolution? Okay, so the market revolution, I guess you guys need to know what that is first. The market revolution is basically the transition from being a farming economy to a factory economy, where stuff is made in factories and then shipped out all across the country. Okay, so transportation is important. Advances in transportation, like railroads and canals and steamships, are important because if you make stuff in a factory, you have to be able to get it out to all the people who want to buy it. And before railroads were invented, it was really hard to move stuff across land. So basically, it wasn't until the railroads were invented and developed that it became easy to make a whole bunch of stuff in one big factory and then sell it to people all across the country. So without railroads, factories wouldn't make sense, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to sell your stuff all across the country. Number 5, what important technologies led to the growth of northern industry? Okay, so there are a couple big ones, but I would say that the most important technologies were the railroad, because this allows you to ship stuff all over the place, the steam engine, and so this allows you to burn coal to create mechanical power. And by using the steam engine, you can power machines. And the third set of important inventions were sort of machines for producing cloth. Stuff like the spinning jenny and the power loom, that were basically machines that replaced human workers with machine work. So the combination of railroads, steam engines, and machines for making cloth were the most important technologies. Number 6, how did the market revolution affect women? It kind of affected women in both a good and a bad way. The good thing about the market revolution is that women were able to go off on their own and get jobs in factories. And this gave women a new degree of independence, even though women in factories were usually not as well paid as men. On the other side, though, women lost a lot of their important role in the house, because before the market revolution, almost everything that you used was made in the house, frequently by women. So the fact now that everything is made in a factory takes away a lot of the power of women who have a family. And this means that women lose a lot of power, and they kind of just become housewives who are totally dependent on their husbands. So for some women, it's a good thing. For other women, it's not so good. You can become a factory worker, but many women also become housewives, totally dependent on their husbands. Okay, so let's go on to number 7. Why were many northern factory workers unhappy with their situation? Okay, so you have these big factories up north, and basically it's easy to find a job, but these jobs in factories are not good. The conditions are really terrible. It's dark and loud and dangerous. The hours are really long. A lot of workers work 13 hours a day, which doesn't really leave you very much time for anything except sleeping and eating. And the pay is not great. The pay is enough to support a family, which is pretty good back in the time, but it's not really enough to do anything else. So you're basically sacrificing all of your time and your health and putting yourself at risk in these dangerous factories to just barely make ends meet. And because of those 3 things, workers were not happy. Number 8, how were women treated before the women's rights movement? Basically, women were treated as property. Women were kind of ruled over by their fathers until they got married, and then they were ruled over by their husbands. If a woman happened to own a lot of property and then she got married, all of her property was given up to her husband. And so women were not well respected at all, and they were viewed as basically servants of men. Women actually became abolitionists a lot because they felt like they were being enslaved by men in the same way that they thought African Americans were being enslaved by Southern plantation owners. Maybe a little bit of an exaggeration, but it does show you how women felt like the situation was really unfair back then. Number 9, what was transcendentalism and what were its main beliefs? So transcendentalism was a philosophical movement that happened mostly in the northern United States, and it was a reaction against the market revolution. The market revolution was like big factories were making all sorts of stuff, and people didn't have to know how to make stuff anymore because they could just buy it from a factory. The transcendentalists thought this was bad, and they were all about a couple of things. One, they were all about nature. They thought it was bad to move to the city and that people should live out in the beautiful nature because that was the work of God and could help you live a more spiritual life. They were for independence and self-reliance. Basically, you should be able to take care of yourself instead of having to buy stuff and depend on everybody else to get by. And they believed that you should be independent in your thinking, that you should always come up with your own ideas and kind of live your own life instead of doing what everybody says you should do. So these guys never really caught on as like a super popular movement, but they remained really important in American culture and American literature. 10. What were the two main types of abolitionism, and what did they believe? So the two main types of abolitionism were colonial abolitionism and, on the other hand, radical abolitionism. So colonial abolitionism believed that white Americans and African Americans could never really get along. So colonial abolitionists wanted to end slavery, but then they wanted to ship all of the African Americans back to Africa. On the other hand, radical abolitionism believed that blacks and whites could get along in America, and so they wanted to free all of these slaves and let them live as American citizens in America. Number 11. Why did colonial abolitionists believe that African Americans should return to Africa? Basically, the answer to this is racism. A lot of white abolitionists, especially at the beginning of the abolition movement, were racist, and they thought slavery is wrong and it's bad and we shouldn't do it. But white people and black people can never get along, and we're totally different, so there's no way we should live in the same country. So they wanted to set up a different country for black people and to send all of them back once they were freed from slavery. So even though colonial abolitionists were against slavery, they were still racist and against the idea of a multicultural or multiracial society. 12. Who was Frederick Douglass? Frederick Douglass is a super cool historical figure. He's one of the most important abolitionists, and he started out life as a slave. He eventually escaped slavery and wrote a best-selling book where he described his life as a slave. So he helped to show Northerners exactly how terrible slavery was by describing his own personal experiences. He was a very eloquent speaker, and he actually lived to see the end of slavery and to continue to fight for equal rights for African Americans after the end of slavery. 13. Why did some Northerners oppose the abolition of slavery? Okay, so a lot of Northerners didn't really like abolition. There were a couple reasons. Poor factory workers didn't want the end of slavery because they were worried that African Americans would move north to northern cities and compete for factory jobs. Also, some textile manufacturers were dependent on southern cotton, so some factory owners needed the South to keep growing a lot of cotton, and they were worried that if slavery ended, the supply of cotton would dry up. And third, and most sadly, is that a lot of Northerners just didn't really care. They thought that African Americans were different and that they didn't deserve the same freedoms that white people deserved. So racism remained a big problem even in the North where there was no slavery. All right, we're going to pause here, and in the next video we're going to move on to Southern society, but I don't want to make this video too long, so I'm going to stop this and upload a separate video for Southern society stuff. Thanks for hanging in there with me, guys.